Katie from Ohio in the United States, and with NEXUS4Change. We also have the Master of Organization Development program at Bowling Green State University, and a whole bunch of people here. Hey, everybody, say wave, wave hi. See up there, see the screen. So wave to Peggy and Tom. Say hi, hi, Peggy. They all see you, and so we're all saying hi. And we've got a really cool design here today. We've got a bunch of people from the Great Lakes region that have come together, and they're looking forward to learning and engaging with Peggy and Tom, as well as a global audience out. And we have a few people in our chat room that are coming in that are joining us as well. We have, like I was saying earlier, we have, let's see here. I'm going to look at, make sure, yeah. We have David. David says he's here from London and he can hear us well. And David, if you want to share with us, I'd love to hear what's the question you're bringing today. And then Geeta says, I'll be running a question that she brings. She says she'll be running dialogues with people in great pain with the aim to help them move forward and not necessarily to retell their story. And she's looking for some possibilities. We have another person here who says, he says, I have read most of your books and I am working on putting together my letter of intent for my dissertation. I'm working on a PhD in organizational development and leadership, and I'd like to do the Delphi technique. And then, let's see here. Yeah, so those are a couple comments there. Christopher up in chat room in Chatsy says, yeah, that's, Christopher, you posted it there too. Great. So Christopher posted about he read most of the books and he's working on his PhD in organizational development and leadership. That's awesome, Christopher. So we're really excited about today, and our focus today is having a few minutes for Peggy and Tom to prime the pump for us to talk a little bit about what they're passionate about and their latest thinking. And Peggy's going to discuss with us her views around emergence and what to do when you don't know what to do. And I think, Peggy, you're doing something really cool over in Amsterdam too. You could maybe share a little bit about that too. And Tom is going to be talking about what his view on work and in communities that's at an all-time high, he says here, as you can see, and looking at employee engagement and the next frontier for organizations seeking a competitive edge. And so we're going to hear from both of them and everybody out here. So what's a question that you're bringing today? Anybody want to throw a question out you're bringing today, or what brings you as you were walking around today? What's something that was percolating for you as we get started? Anybody want to share one?
What is going on in the world that is bringing on together? Hey, this is Marcela. So I wanted to know what is going on in the world that is bringing us together as change practitioners or as change agents.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else want to share one? The question that's percolating for you? Yeah. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris Geitz from E-Extension, and I'm curious about the role of the heart and our connection with our heart in this work.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Sure. Why don't you stand up so they can talk to you? Come on.
Hi.
Because they can see you, they're right there.
Very baby step question. My name is Jennifer, and my question is, what do we mean when we say this work? What are we even talking about?
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. So those are a few questions. More will pop up. So Christopher and David, and those in the chat room and those here, as you are listening, talk with each other or pose a question just as you're listening. So you don't have to wait till a certain point in time. Just share a reaction, share a question, whatever you might wish to bring up, and we'll pause at different points in time and throughout the day. But we'll first start with Peggy sharing her story and her thinking, and then we'll move to Tom sharing his thinking and so forth. And then we'll pause and have a group discussion in the room here and in the chat room. We'll talk a little bit about what we're hearing, what reactions we have, and then we'll open it back up and have a conversation with Peggy and Tom. So I am ready for Peggy. Okay. Yep.
So let's see. Do you need to do something to share my screen?
I do. Hold on.
And it doesn't look like we're recording yet. Do you want to be?
I have it recording on my end.
Okay, great. Good.
Okay, Peggy, take her away.
So, hi, and let's see. I'm actually not seeing the room at the moment, so I'm operating a little bit blind. And I'm moving on, apparently. Let's see. Sorry about I can't see you, but presumably you can see me. So
yes, we can see you.
Great. So this theme of what to do when you don't know what to do, I chose it, as Steve mentioned, because it's a topic that is a theme of a conference happening in October in Amsterdam, to the question of places for change agents to come together. And I think since that conference was announced, I'm aware of 2 others with similar themes. So this topic is up right now. And I think it's up for a very good reason. We have been in a pretty stable state for quite a number of years. And if you stop and think about when people feel like they don't know what to do, what's going on? It's a situation where the status quo doesn't seem to serve the needs of the time. And so by definition, when we're in situations where we don't know what to do, it's because business as usual has been disrupted in some way. And so part of my answer to that question becomes understanding patterns of complexity as a doorway into thinking about about possible responses. And so as a student of complexity, I looked at what does it have to teach us about the way we interact in social systems. And I want to share a pattern with you that I found through that work, and offer some strategies for how I work with that pattern to the question of what does the work look like. This is part of my answer to that question. So I want to start here with the notion of emergence, which is the idea of a novelty arising out of a complex situation. And as I was saying at the beginning, if we start in terms of thinking of a relatively stable state, a coherent kind of way of being where we know our roles, we know what the interactions are, we know what we're supposed to do, and that's disrupted in some way. Well, for one thing, disruption for many of us can mean the death of things as they are, and so it is a time that tends to be quite emotional. We don't know what to do, so grief, loss, anger, all of that can show up, as can joy and excitement from those that are in a position where they enter that doorway of disruption with a sense of curiosity and the desire to do something different. And so part of my insight when working with this natural phenomenon of disruption is the relationship that we have with it makes a tremendous amount of difference in our capacity to deal with it. So what happens when there's disruption? Whatever our response to it, we end up into a mode that often feels very chaotic, where people are scrambling, they're trying new things, they're trying to hold, some are trying to hold on. I'm thinking about the example right now of what happened in Charlottesville and how we've been responding to it around the country. And what I observe are some people getting angrier, getting more active, some more alt-right rallies taking place, more people trying different strategies for either suppressing that or fighting against it. And interesting examples, one of the ones that I find most intriguing is a colleague who has been going to alt-right rallies and setting up what he calls an empathy tent for listening. And in that process of listening, doing it a la the work of Marshall Rosenberg and nonviolent communication. So not just listening, but reflecting back what's being heard, and swapping, so that asking those he's listening to practice their own listening skills as well. But the upshot is, during this period of differentiation, of trying different things, over time, eventually, we begin to find some things that seem to make a difference, those differences that make a difference. And ultimately, in the best of circumstances, that leads to a new and different kind of coherence, where we do once again have some sense of our interactions, our relationships to each other, and the activities that we do that have some semblance of stability. Now, one thing I'd say is that there's no guarantee that we actually come to a new coherence. Things truly can fall apart and never come back together. But what is it that we can do as practitioners when we're working with communities and organizations, such that when disruption happens, we discover the differences that make a difference, such that new coherence arises? And I'll say a few words about that. Starting with this notion, okay, we're in disruption, now what? How do we design for emergence? And what I found through the years of doing this work is the notion of creating some kind of container, sort of a bubble in the chaos, and the qualities of that container that I find most effective hold both compassion, which is of the heart, and curiosity. And I find that there are three actions that contribute to creating great containers. And the first is to bring focus through the use of generative questions. And by generative, I mean questions that, again, interrupt the status quo. So they're working with that disruption, but they're doing it in a way that draws us in, that attracts us, that makes us curious. And that happens because they point to something aspirational. And they're always open-ended questions that act both as an attractor to the people who are affected and who are part of that system. And they act as they provide some kind of focus, some direction, while leaving lots of room for experimentation. And side by side with finding those questions to ask are attending to who needs to be in the room. What is the diversity that makes up this particular system? And that includes those that perhaps we feel like, oh, we don't want them in the room. When people say that, that always raises a flag for me, that those are exactly the people that we need to find a question that is big enough that includes them, anyone we call them. And so I've been in conversation with colleagues, including some on the ground in Charlottesville, about what's a generative question that invites, the left, the right, and those who are looking to bridge differences amongst the many perspectives that exist. And then the final element is this notion of being welcoming. People talk about safe space, and I actually prefer the word welcome or hospitable spaces, because if a space is too safe, nothing changes. So again, generative questions, diversity, and welcoming. And into that space, we design for engagement. And two key elements, whatever the myriad form of approaches to engagement, I find make a difference. One is that there's room for authentic expression that brings not just our minds, but our heads, our hearts, our bodies, our spirits, that we show up in a holistic way and feel invited, welcome to voice our whole self. And through the process of doing that, and stories in particular is a mode of that I'm particularly drawn to, because they inherently bring the wholeness of us forward. We begin to connect with each other. And through that connection, we do the work of seeking meaning through periodically reflecting, listening for what's emerging, and looking for those generative images, ideas that attract us and draw us together in some way. And I find the turning point to a new coherence is we go from an I and them to an I and we. And that's often the turning point. So create a container, engage, and seek meaning. I'll stop there. Offer one other picture is when we're designing, deliberately designing for these kinds of events, the work that comes before and the work that comes after is as critical as what we do in the middle. And I put this up as kind of a gestalt of the questions I ask when hosting organizations or hosting conversations in organizations and communities. And on that note, I want to turn it over to Tom to pick up the thread of how do you prepare and how do you follow up?
Can't hear you, Tom.
How's that? Can everybody see the screen? Can you hear me? Good deal. All right, I just need to move my camera over. Peggy taught me a cool trick today, which I didn't have time to set up everything in, but I'm set up for the presentation now. I come at this from the standpoint of I've been fortunate enough in my career to actually end up going through a series of, falling into a series of things that actually help me get much better at understanding the whole notion of how groups interact and how people can get to be effective. After a Big Six consulting stint, I ended up in my own business practice for 25 years. And 2 years ago, I found this phenomenal company that does employee surveys that really kind of get at the heart of what some of the cultural things are in an organization about how the culture supports strategy. I'm the consulting group, so what we do is we take this kind of diagnostic things we're doing, and then we really go to more of a generative type mode to say, how do we figure out what could be things that are better? So group methods, because of my work with Peggy and Steve for the past few years, have always been kind of a big part of what I do. I've been able to have the luxury of seeing a whole bunch of organizations try to implement group methods and, in fact, any sort of action planning. And I found that the state of the art is not very good, unfortunately. As things happen, people have great intentions. They start a meeting, and the meeting is a great meeting, but then afterwards kind of things fizzle out. So what I want to focus on is how do we actually maximize the impact of group methods? And specifically, I'm looking at this, coming at this from the standpoint very much from a corporate perspective. We've got perspectives from a community standpoint too, and I'll inject some of those, but primarily my work these days is with corporations. So we're talking about how do you actually get a competitive edge based on how you get people together, get them to be energized, get their heart in the work, and get them to be able to do something. So as we take a look at the group methods, what I would say is the next thing is I asked the question, what's the source of the bad rap that some group methods are getting? Some people say, oh, we tried appreciative inquiry last year and it didn't work. Or, gosh, we tried, future search, that stuff, it looks like it works well in the book, but it doesn't work, which is crazy because I've used all those things. And if you do it right, they work. So it brings to mind, my question is, what's missing from this picture? And so what ends up being missing from this picture is we've got group method, but let me kind of give a clue. So if we're just focusing on group methods, we get this sort of an interesting little spike. Peggy did talk a lot about things about, creating an effective container. That's really an art to be able to do that well. So often what we do is create an effective container. We move from I, them to I, we inside the method, but then people go back to their actual day-to-day jobs and very little gets implemented based on what we talked about inside that large group method. And so what I've come to say is what's missing from this picture is, I call this the bookend approach, is we've got some before activities that need to go on, and we've got some after activities that need to go on. So here's some sample before activities. One sample before activity is collaborative design meetings. I really learned the benefit of these when we didn't do them. No matter what method you select, so if it's appreciative inquiry, if it's search conference, any sort of thing you're trying to work on, there's always something that you can ask the system about to get involved with to help co-design what's going on. You don't want to come in just with, here's this template, I'm the expert facilitator, here's what we're going to be going through. So I like to host collaborative design meetings to get people's input on the areas they can provide input in. So things like, what's the planning horizon you're looking for? What are some of the business challenges that you've got? What are some guidelines that your leaders may have given you? What are our boundaries? What are our constraints? So these collaborative design meetings do a couple things for you. First of all, they help socialize part of the system who's going to be in that meeting to say, hey, this is a pretty cool thing to do. And the second thing, after you get that content acceptance, is you then, inside that larger group method, when you've convened these 50 or 100 people, you've got a core group of people who actually are on board with this. And if somebody starts being skeptical next to them, they can come back and they can say, hey, I was in the co-design of this. I think this is a really cool thing and it's going to be good. So these collaborative design meetings, I'm very much excited about trying to get these things to do as a sample. Another sample before activity I like to do is, excuse me, I've been on the road for the last 2 weeks and airplanes are not good for colds, and I contracted a doozy. So we've got a strengths perspective and also a positive leadership. The whole research of David Cooperrider, I think, is fantastic, and Kim Cameron for positive leadership. Just a minute. These are very important because if we approach any of these group methods with just, we have this laundry list of problems to solve, it's nowhere near as effective as saying, what are some of the strengths we need to build on? And you can certainly go after the same things that are the issues, but approach it from a strength-based perspective. Kim Cameron talks a lot about, positive leadership. It says, viewing things positively, looking for relationships, making meanings in a positive way, communications in a positive way, as opposed to kind of being a downer boss as you go in. And he's got a lot of research that talks about how statistically this provides, profits that drop through to the bottom line. Another example of things that I like to talk about before activities, boundary and guideline setting. And we don't want a huge laundry list of things to go on. Often in OD terms, people will talk about minimum critical specifications. So we're just looking at saying, here are some of the things that are on the table for design, and you might want to go after these. And here are some things that are off the table. Don't go after some of these things. So, for example, years ago when we were doing a search conference at Microsoft, at the time, Bill Gates said, what's off the table is, don't talk about cable because we don't want to be in any sort of cable activities right now, but everything else is open. The more minimum you can get, the better off you are. But if you can actually set that boundaries and guidelines beforehand so the leader feels comfortable, because the leader, especially in many organizations, corporations, sometimes is a little bit reluctant to go in and turn over control to somebody else to plan. And so this is a little bit of a safety net for the leader to say, hey, to keep them from doing like really crazy things that aren't in our plan, is I'm going to give them some boundaries, I'm going to give them some guidelines I want them to use. Then we do the group methods, then we do the after activities. So one of the things that I like from a boundary standpoint is there are all kinds of these frameworks. So McKinsey has a 7S framework. I've used this thing called the performance framework that I've developed. And you want to take a look and see if there's any of these things you want to give some boundaries or constraints on. So you talk about, are there any strategy things like, we don't want to be in the cable market. Are there any process guidelines or constraints saying, gosh, we really would like to accelerate the product launch cycle that we've got and do that to 2 to 3 times. So give people a thought there. Information communication and learning is another kind of set of things that impact performance. HR practices. Often these things are off the table, but there are some things that you can actually say, you know, from a hiring standpoint, what should we be doing in hiring that's different? You want to talk about culture, you want to talk about any sort of structure and relationships. So just kind of from a big picture perspective, it's a nice thing to go around that wheel and say, you know, before we go into this, is there any input that the leader would have to encourage people to go after something, or to zone off an area and say, that's not what we're looking at doing? So I always like to have kind of a pragmatic thing when I talk to corporations. Here's a starter checklist for what you want to think about for these before activities. First of all, it's getting a clear definition of the problem or the opportunity. This is really important because otherwise, if you don't have a good purpose statement that you can organize around, people are going to spend a lot of time and they may have addressed the wrong thing. You want to involve the right people. You also want to establish boundaries. And so this is almost, I like to think of this as a circle almost, where you look at what the purpose is, you look at the people, look at the boundaries. And if you kind of come back to the purpose and say, maybe we need to change the purpose a little bit because the boundaries really would be better served here, or we want these people involved because we think they've got a great perspective and they're not technically in the boundary. Check into the above, make sure you've got that best package of those three things, because that ends up being your first picture of design. And you want people who've got a heart in this. The question came up earlier about, you know, how do we get the heart into this? You want to make sure you've got people who actually have got some sort of passion involved in this, not just analytical folks who say, yes, I think these are the three things we need to do for our strategy. Before the session, you want to generate some excitement and anticipation. We've talked often with marketing departments and say, how do we market this event that's coming up? And you often get some great ideas, putting things on the kind of a corporate HDTV, putting things on a wiki. Part of this is that kind of that collaborative design team I talked about. You also want to make explicit the mindsets and behaviors that are needed both during the event and after the event. And this is because often what we're looking at doing is something totally different than we're doing right now. So when Peggy talks about emergence, she's talking about disrupting the current status quo. We want to let people know not only that it's okay to do that, but we'd like to push them to do that. If we don't say that beforehand, you might get people who are a little bit timid inside the event, not knowing where the boundaries are, especially if they've got a boss in the room who traditionally has been kind of against change. You also want to make explicit the mindsets and behaviors that are needed after the event. After the event, you got to figure out what's going on as far as, you know, how do I need to support this? What's the mindset change? We used to be kind of a problem-solving organization that was dedicated to firefighting. Now we want to move to be a proactive organization. We want to focus on the positive, some of the Kim Cameron stuff. So, you know, how do we foster positive relationships among different people in different groups? Well, I've seen simple techniques. People would just go on and say, hey, you know, I think you need to get together with the director in engineering. You need to get together with the director in manufacturing. I don't know what for. Just have lunch and see what comes up. Some of the best conversations come out of that. You also want to set expectations for post-event follow-up. As we're getting into in a little bit, I kind of touched on earlier, one of the problems I see is that there's not enough structured follow-up afterwards. In communities, this is often easier to do because people are often more passionate about what they're doing. But in organizations, people might be passionate inside the meeting, but they go back to work, their boss doesn't really get measured on how this gets implemented, unless you change the system to make sure you do that, which we'll talk about. Competing priorities happen. All the things that were off on somebody's to-do list, now all of a sudden they come back from the conference after 3 days, they got to go after those. And so there's a high risk that events, post-event follow-up is going to be low. So this is kind of our checklist before activities, trying to set the stage for what goes on. So here are some sample after activities we talked about before. Here's just 3 samples. First of all, is communication to the organization. There ought to be some sort of mass communication to the mass part of the organization. What went on in one of these group methods? So if it was changing a strategic direction, if it was changing a structure inside an organization, it was addressing a particularly wicked problem that people have. Don't just let that sit inside that group that was there off for a couple of days. Make sure that gets communicated to the organization. That also, in kind of a nice subtle way, hold some accountability to the people who are inside that session to say, we've got to do some follow-up afterwards. Action tracking is, though it sounds kind of command and control, I've actually kind of gone back from my egalitarian, hey, people should follow their passion, to say it can be helpful to have a central list of all the actions that are supposed to happen. So people signed up to do 7 things, and you've got 7 teams working on that. Have a central tracking of that, so you can actually see what the deadlines are, what the deadlines were that were met, and also track results afterwards to make sure you're getting some good business results. We've started to go into, based on kind of what the issue is, if you can fix something and get some positive results within a 90-day period, try to settle for a 90-day period. Don't have these long 1 or 2 year projects that go on. Try a little, experiment, see how that goes. Try a little more, experiment more. That's becoming more the wave of, I think, what OD practitioners who are in the know are doing. Jervis Bush talks a lot about that in his book about generative change. Sponsorship groups are important. In organizations, again, more so than communities, a sponsorship group is a couple executives, might even be the entire executive team for a small organization. The benefit of this is the sponsorship group really has 3 major activities. The sponsorship group is responsible for being a cheerleader and supporting those action planning teams. And that means a lot to organizations, especially if you've got some mid and lower level people, to have senior managers going in and saying, hey, we're behind you. What can we give you to make this happen? So the first thing is that notion of kind of being a cheerleader and supporter. Second thing is the sponsorship group really needs to go in and hold these people accountable. They need to hold them accountable for progress. So you said you're going to get this done by February 12th. It hasn't happened. What resources do you need to make sure, and when can we have a new due date? And also accountability to the strategic plan. You don't want people going outside the realm of the strategy unless that was part of what their charge is, basically based on what the outcome of the particular event was. The third thing the sponsorship group can do is, if you've got a number of these action planning teams going on, the sponsorship group ends up being this repository of best practices for organizational change inside the organization, which is huge, because they'll see something going on and they say, the folks in the engineering team, they addressed this thing 3 weeks ago, so you guys are going to go talk to Bob because Bob really knows what's going on in that area. So a sponsorship group we found is an important thing, because the other thing, in an organization, if you've got some people go back to their department, what's going to happen is departmental priorities can easily overwhelm and swamp what all the good work was that went on in that safe container, where people disrupted change, looked at something else. The pressure to go back to the status quo is often huge. And so a sponsorship group ends up, since they're cross-functional, they end up being able to take a look at this department and say, hey, you said you're going to be doing this, your departmental priorities might have said they're this, but you also, this is a priority, and we're some executives who've got some executive clout. You need to have that ability to go in and do that. So kind of from my pragmatic standpoint, starter checklist for after activities is we want to record follow-up items. We want to say, explicitly, what do we expect from people? We use some event outcomes. We want to check progress. This is that action tracking list, electronically and structurally, and then kind of check to ensure that there's team harmony going on. You're not going to get very good results if your team is not playing well together. And then finally, checking ensure to make sure that the results are being measured. So what happens is, the big question, the wrap up here is, as you're going through and choosing, some fantastic group method that you've researched, you say it's a good fit for the issue you're trying to tackle, is what are you going to put in your bookends? What's in your before activities and what's in your after activities? So with that, I'll turn it back over to Steve.
Thank you, Tom and Peggy. So what we're going to do now is we are going to take a minute to get in some trios, and in the chat room out there in chat land, and in here, I'd like to hear from you. 3 questions. What did you hear? What are your reactions? And what questions do you have that are percolating up for you? And come up with a question. So in trios, what did you hear? What are your reactions? And what questions do you have? Out in chat land, let's do the same thing. Would love to have you discuss that. We'll take about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and have some conversation. Hey, Peggy. So while they're chatting, and everybody out there, we can be kind of talking with each other and the people in Chatland can be a part of our conversation, be chatting and posing some questions, and then we'll bring some questions up live, but we can just use this moment. One of the things that happened, Peggy, was your screen didn't show up. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I think I can hear you, but it was low. I'm just checking to see if I need to turn my. Okay, go ahead and try again, Peggy. Talk again. Yeah, I can hear you.
On my end?
I can hear you just fine. Yeah, I can hear you just fine. I'm good. So I was going to interrupt you. However, you were describing things so well and talking so nicely about everything and in a flow. I thought it would do more harm than good to interrupt you and try to get your screen up, because I thought what you were saying was very easy to follow and understand, and you were just telling a great story. So I chose not to interrupt you. However, we're good.
When did you lose
I think from the very beginning. When I'd switched over, I didn't switch over. Yeah, and so I'm going to switch back to you. And I thought maybe you were timing it, like doing a little bit of an introduction, then going to pull your slides up. But then I realized it wasn't, and then so and actually it was really great what you were sharing. So I don't think it hurt anything. However, when we come back for Q&A, I think I'm going to switch back over to the screen for you so you can pull up some of your key slides you might want to use in answering your questions. So we'll make sure we can get them up there. And I'll practice right now. I'm going to practice right now with you while people are chatting and coming up with questions. So for everybody in chat land out here, if you have some questions, post some of your questions in the GoToWebinar chat panel, and or in the let me switch over here to, hey, let me see where, Peggy, I'm switching to you right now. It should be popping up and asking you to share your screen.
Go to presentation mode.
Yep, there it is. Yep, we see your screen now. No problem.
And now you have the slides.
Now I have it right now. Perfect. Just the way we were playing. So we see your slides. So if you want to, you can, even while we're sitting here, you could just kind of slowly scroll through for people that were curious about what you were referring to, and then you can bring up some slides to address your questions, since we're all kind of sitting here for the next 3 minutes. And for people in Chatland, if you have a question, Christopher has a question, great. And so you can also raise your questions, everybody, in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'm looking in here.
You know, I don't see either the chat or the questions since I got bumped off and came back. So
okay, I'll share them with you. I'll make sure I'm watching for the questions. I'll be asking and repeating the questions to you. We'll have questions from here in the room, and then we'll have some questions in Chatsy and so forth. So I'll just ask you the questions, and I'll ask for the people to you. So I'm looking at all your slides now. Everything looks good. Okay.
One other thing is I currently am not seeing everyone's you and Tom
camera.
The camera.
Yeah, something. We're seeing you just fine. So it's just on your end what's happening.
Okay.
But for everybody out here, everything is good.
Yeah, Peggy, that happened to me. And when I drug a few of the windows around, I found that the video stuff got buried in the back.
Okay.
And that's what I thought happened to your presentation. I thought yours was buried behind mine. Otherwise, I would have stopped you. So sorry about that. But I think it was incredible, because I thought, oh my gosh, she decided to do it without the slides, like I was going to do it.
Oh, how funny! Well, I'm glad it worked.
Yeah, it worked. It was brilliant, Peggy. It was like you didn't need the slides. You were great without them, and I think they kind of do a nice job complimenting you. But you were perfect without them, actually. So. And so everybody's here, they're seeing your slides, they're seeing your screen, the people out here, and the people in the room are seeing them as they're talking. But we'll come back in about, I'll take about a minute, and then I'm going to come back in with some Q&A with you all, okay?
Okay,
cool. Thanks.
And
Tom, are you seeing questions in chat?
Yes, I'm seeing an audience question. Peggy, please share the details of the conference. And Adam, I might be able to join.
Great.
There you go. So I'm seeing that. Are you not seeing the window that's got chat on it?
I see the window, but it's there's nothing showing in it.
It's interesting. It's kind of like I saw the window of attendees, but nobody was showing in that one. So it's interesting. I still see no attendees in my attendees window. So interesting.
I see there are 17. To the person who asked about the details of the conference, the dates are October. Oh,
can you pull it up on your screen, the website? We're still seeing your screen, Peggy. So if you, just so you know, so yeah. So if you want to, you can pull it up on the website and show everybody that. We'll show everybody. It's showing everybody in the room here too.
So the Coast Collective Challenging Organizations in Society is the organization, and it's just outside Amsterdam, October 18th through 22nd. And this is the website, cos-collective.com. We'll get you there. And I'll put this in the chat, although it doesn't look like my chat will go. I can't send to attendees.
I see it in mine. Maybe that's just because I'm another organizer or presenter.
Yeah, you're a panelist, so you see it.
Panelist.
Maybe you can send it on to everyone.
Let's see.
Okay, we're going to be starting in just about 30 seconds for everybody out there.
So I'm doing a bit of scrolling through. The organizers of the conference, one is an Israeli friend, Tova Averbuk, and the other is from just outside Amsterdam. And they're bringing people from a wide variety of disciplines who come at this question from different perspectives. And these are the organizers, Tova and Tani. And so
Peggy, I'll be in Amsterdam on the 30th of August, and I'm going there to meet with the university, the Anne Frank House, and I'd love to say hi to them if they're interested in this, because we're going to be bringing our executive doctorate students to Amsterdam for an international study tour, and they'll stop there for 2 days. Stop there for 2 days and meet and learn, and then we'll go down to Cape Town, South Africa for 5 days.
Well, if you like, I'll introduce you to Tani, who is the one who lives in Amsterdam.
I'd love that. I'd love that.
Okay.
That'd be great. I'd appreciate that.
Happy to do that.
So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to bring everybody together, and we're tag teaming on making sure we don't have reverb. So I go back and forth between the speaker in here and speaker there. So you'll see me pointing back and forth to the person doing the audio. So, okay. So hi, everybody. We could bring it together. If we could bring it together, and so if you want to wrap up and okay, all right. So let's go ahead and bring it together. Great. So Peggy and Tom, you provoked so much conversation. They're ignoring me here. You know that's a good thing, right? I always call
the professor at the end, though.
I always call it collaborative rebellion or cooperative rebellion. So it's good stuff, and so it's great to be engaged in the conversation. So we have some questions from the group. We'll pose some questions here. We're going to start with a question out from Chatland. We have Christopher. And he says, Tom, your approach aligns very well with the general model of planning. 1, understand the problem. 2, diagnosing. 3, planning and implementing, and evaluating, institutionalizing. Can you explain a little bit about how your approach encourages dialogue, leading to social construction of emerging realities?
Oh, great question. Well, for one thing, always in the group method, in the event, there's going to be dialogue. Part of the ground rules are things like, all perspectives are valid, see no stripes, wear no stripes. So definitely you create that container for that to actually exist inside that the major event. I've also started to go through and say, even before that major event, sometimes it's good to host just simple dialogue sessions. So for example, we did in a search conference a while ago, we did for a large pharmaceutical company who was going into a new area. Before we did that search conference where you got people together to do planning for 3 days, we did a series of dialogue sessions talking about what are the assumptions that we have going into this conference and what are the implications of those assumptions. So in dialogue, and again, we said, we don't want any actions out of this. We just want people to suspend judgment, listen, and understand the fabric of what's going on. So that kind of just summarizes dialogue is apparent definitely inside the event. And I've started to include it in a lot of the things before the event. And you can, of course, include it as a routine management practice after the event. Because the nice thing about having one of these large events where you have dialogue, especially for people who may not have experienced it before, is they say, wow, that was pretty useful. We can have a series of those afterwards. So afterwards, it just becomes something that is part of the management practice, and it ends up not being a, quote, event that we need to plan.
Can I weigh in a bit, because your framing of the question, this may be a place where Tom and I actually part company a bit in terms of the follow-on. Communication, support for activities, I think we both agree on. I actually see when we're working with emergent kinds of practices that in many ways we're creating the path as we walk it. So in a sense, the work becomes absolutely to follow up on what people have said about commitments, but to also be listening for what has shifted as a result of what we've done that may actually take us down a different path because of things we've discovered as we've gone along. I've actually begun in the last few years to introduce a practice called developmental evaluation as an approach to evaluation and assessment, because rather than assessing to some preset plan from beforehand, when you don't actually know exactly what's going to come out the other end, it works on the basis of learning and supporting what's developing as an outcome. So you are constructing reality through dialogue as you go. So I have a hunch, Tom, you may actually agree with what I'm saying, that it's not as neat and tidy as it sounded as you were presenting.
Actually, no, that's a great point, because and even the question sounded like it was a nice, solid 3 stages kind of thing. It's often quite emergent even after the session. We did one of these things when I was in South Africa years ago, and we were working with the government agency, turning them into self-managed teams. And so we did, a nice design, and 2 weeks later, and they're supposed to have these 90-day plans like we talked about. 2 weeks later, they got in touch with me and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Tom." I said, "Well, what was the deal?" They said, "Well, we changed the design because it wasn't going to work for us." I said, "That's perfect. That's what you've been empowered to do." So often, a lot of what keeps us in unfortunately, the lockstep of plan, manage, control is what we've been accustomed to, and we do need to go through, and that's kind of part of what I talked about in the pre-planning before the actual event, is set the mindset for afterwards. And one of the mindsets is, don't have these big change efforts that go on for a year. Is do an experiment, learn something, do an experiment, learn something, and change what you see. So I think probably what comes with this is part of it is messaging for executives who might not be willing to say they're going to let us just do kind of a discovery-based planning as we go along. And so they like to see something that looks more structured. But in the actual evaluation of these things, the execution of these things, people are very free to change within what they do. But I guess probably for the messaging part of this is CEOs tend to like things in nicer boxes. Most of the CEOs that we work with. So yeah, that's a good point, Peggy. Good pickup on that.
Okay, so we have one of the groups. Somebody has a question for you, and if you want to introduce yourself and maybe just a little bit about what brought you here or where you're from, and then your question. Yep.
Yeah, hi, I'm Andrea. I came in from Toronto yesterday. We drove down, a bunch of us, and I work in OD up at a university in Canada. Our team was talking about, and this is something that I find really fascinating, what Peggy was talking about disruption and moving from we to I to we instead of I to them, is a real vulnerability that it takes from everybody in the room to step up. And so the question that came up in our little group was, what are the preconditions for human vulnerability to show up in that way? What do people really need to have with them, or how can we help people? And maybe this goes to what Tom is saying, to do the pre-work so that they can show up with some vulnerability.
It's a terrific question. I'm waiting for the echo to fade a bit. I'll tell a little story and then back into what it teaches about preconditions, because honestly, I think we actually need less preparation than you would think, just more mindful preparation than we often do. For me, the elements of creating a container are what shape those preconditions. A generative question, a spirit of welcome, and that mix of who makes up the system present. Now, how we work with that is, I think, what enables the kind of quality of vulnerability such that you do get authentic expression. And I have found, or I've come to the belief that for most of us, debate is our fundamental form of communication. It's our default. And if you look at the root of debate, it means to beat down. And it's what we do to each other, right? We use our words, we use our arguments in a very win-lose kind of way. And goodness knows we're seeing this play out big time in our political system. If you look at our legal system, it's an advocacy system. It's based in win-lose. And this is our default way of interacting with each other. And what dialogic methods do is they shift that default through the kind, and they don't even necessarily do it explicitly. We do it mindfully, we do it implicitly through the things like asking generative questions, because dialogue isn't inherently a generative form of interaction. And it's, if you look at its Latin root, it's about meaning flowing through. And it sets us up in a mode where inquiry, making connections, discovering the relationships amongst things, it holds a greater diversity, because at its heart, it's about inquiry. So, so those are some of the ideas. The specific example, the quickest way I know into this is through storytelling. A great example, I've got some colleagues who work in something they call the transpartisan movement, where they bring people together across the political spectrum. And the way they open their convenings is to invite people in pairs to share with each other what it meant to them to be an American when they were 7 years old. And those stories shift everything, because what you see when people tell their stories is what shaped their belief system, where their values actually began to develop through their experience in childhood. And so rather than meeting them as the other, we begin to see the ways in which some of the underlying beliefs or values that shape them connect with our own life experiences. And that sets up a radically different sense of connection and vulnerability. So again, one of the best ways I know to create that sort of generative field is through storytelling.
Actually, I would add on to that. I love storytelling. In fact, what I'll often do is get with one of the more senior leaders in the organization and tell them I'd like them to come up with kind of the story of where they want things to go. And I want them to share some key vulnerability that will make other people feel comfortable sharing vulnerabilities. Often if you have the top person or the second person in the organization go in and say, hey, this is something I really was disappointed at the result. I wish I'd done this differently, and then talk about moving forward.
Peggy, we still see your screen. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, no, I was just saying that sets the stage. Is if you have a senior member of the organization demonstrate some sort of vulnerability, that helps get other people comfortable doing that. Now, you don't want it to be something like, very basic, like, the CFO to say, I never understood discounted cash flow analysis, but something in an organizational context was, gosh, I wish I'd done this differently, and I think we have a chance to do something right today. A little bit of mea culpa actually, makes people say, gosh, we're all starting the same ground. Let's go forward. So I think that is a powerful way, adding on to Peggy's storytelling, talking about that, is to load one of those into a story.
Great, thank you. We have another question. We have a few more, so hopefully we got some time. It's a little after 12 our time, or on the hour. How many more minutes do you all have to chat with us?
I'm good.
5, 10 minutes? Can we have you for 5 or 10 more minutes?
You bet.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, great. So here's another question. And Peggy, also, if you want, you can make your screen a little, make your box a little bit bigger. If you could just broaden that box a little bit bigger, but still keep it in the informal setting on there, so people can see that there. That's perfect. Great. Thank you. So, hi. So you want to just introduce yourself in a little bit about what you do, and then your question.
Okay. Hi, my name's Rick Fenwick. I'm from the Detroit area, and I'm an OD consultant. I'm also an adjunct professor. Peggy, when you were talking earlier, you used the word coherence, and I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the meaning of that word in the context of your work. Thank you.
Ooh, let's see. I guess I'd say we have a coherent system when it's got some elements of predictability and sustainability to it. Essentially, we know its boundary conditions such that we know where we fit, we know what the relationships are with each other. We know if we do X, the likelihood is high that Y would happen. So it's that sense of a stable state. Now, if a system becomes too static, if we know everything about it, then we're in serious trouble. And of course, when it becomes utterly chaotic, it's where nothing is predictable. We're also in trouble. So it's somewhere in that zone of relative confidence that we know the assumptions that through which things take place. It's kind of a loose description. But hopefully that answers your question. If not, come back at me.
Tom, you have any thoughts?
No, I think it's Peggy's description actually addressed that very well. I just think of coherence as trying to get, I guess, loosely, the simple rules all going in the same direction.
We have another question for you.
Hi, my name's Felicia Henderson. I'm also from the Detroit area. I'm a newspaper editor and a recent MOD graduate. I wondered if either of you have consulted with newspapers, given the changing state of newspapers. The Wall Street Journal is undergoing a lot of change, and they actually posted for a news editor in organization development position. So just wanted to get your thoughts on newspapers today and if you've worked with them.
I think Peggy, you've been just really teed up on this one.
Yeah, I have been working with, actually, I would like to get your name and contact information. I will put you in touch with journalists who are working in an engaged way. I have been working with news organizations since 1999 and helped co-found something called Journalism That Matters, which at this point is looking at the role of news and information that supports communities to thrive. It's part of a subset of news organizations that look at engagement through a relational lens, and really looking at how they shift their relationship with the communities that they serve, beginning, thank goodness, to finally question the notion of objectivity as you know, a guiding approach to doing news in an interdependent world. So I can point you to numerous resources, and I have to say, running into an editor who is also an OD person is exciting to me, and there are kindred spirits that are doing some great work with community engagement, and I'd be happy to connect you in. There's a Facebook group called Experience Engagement. I've been running conferences with journalists since 2001. So the Experience Engagement Facebook group is a group I encourage you to consider joining, and contact me if you want to know more.
Okay, great. So I will make sure I connect her with you. She's a recent graduate of our MOD program here, and so I'll give her your email. Is that okay, Peggy?
Please do.
Okay, we'll do. Okay, that sounds good. So we have two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. We have one question from Lee, who is here, and then we have one question online from the chat community, and then we'll wrap up. Okay. So, hi, Lee.
Hi, my name's Lee. I'm a current student in the Masters of OD at Bowling Green, and when our group was talking, we thought a lot about how you decide who are the right people to have in the group. Tom, you mentioned this both in the design team context and in the event itself, and it seems like you don't really know ahead of time, right? So if you exclude people, or if you get a little too calculating about it, you might miss some things. So how do you think about that? What's the best way to manage that?
I'll continue kind of on my model and give this to Peggy, because she and I have talked a lot about this. Again, I think it's a circle of figuring out what you think your initial purpose is, and then figuring out what the boundaries that you're trying to address are, and then you invite people. And often what you might find is that, you know, gosh, if we do that, we're missing Linda, who's this extraordinary mind that's, you know, something that, you know, beyond what most people have. And so you might say, well, if you extend the boundary, we could, you know, legitimately include Linda in this, and that would slightly change the purpose. And then you can kind of circle around like that. So for me, yeah, I never end up with the same people or the same exact purpose that I started out with, or the exact same boundaries. Peggy, what have you found?
Well, I'll build on what you say, because purpose and who's in the room is an iterative process. It's part of the reason the notion of collaborative design teams are so important, because when you bring in someone who you didn't necessarily think of originally, it changes the dynamics and potentially changes the question. There's a rubric from Marv Weisbord and Sandra Janoff in their future search work that I find particularly helpful as a way of thinking about it. So I'll state it in a general term search. This comes from Harrison Owen, who created open space technology, who says, you want the people who care. And to kind of give that a little more specificity, Marvin and Sandra offer the acronym, you want the people who are in, the people with authority, resources, expertise, information, and need. And I have found that rubric a really useful checklist to go through. And I'll often, when working with a design group, create what's called a sociogram, where you draw a circle of the way you're thinking about your purpose, and look at the various groups, circles of the various groups and or individuals that have a connection to that topic. And the closeness to the topic where you put the circle is an indicator of more or less how close that particular group is to the topic, and the size of it is the population. So for example, I've been doing some work with education of late, and clearly students are a huge group and are very close in, as are parents. And then of course teachers and administrators and those who train teachers, and the larger community, the business community, start being some of the other circles that appear. And having made those maps, there's also a decision point that comes because given the question that you're asking, I actually work to stretch the boundaries such that we may actually come in a little bit in terms of who we actually invite to participate in what we're doing. By having gone in a broad way, it helps people get clear about where they're drawing their boundaries. And I always encourage them to keep those boundaries as permeable as possible. So for example, it may be, we don't want to do broad ask invitation to the business community, but perhaps there is someone who's also a parent who brings that perspective present, so you have it in the space.
Thank you, Peggy. So here's the final question. It's for both of you. K-U-H-N, and I'm going to say that's Khan or Kuhn, says the structure of scientific revolutions denotes. Oh, that's okay. I'm sorry, it wasn't it. The person.
Oh, Thomas Kuhn.
Denotes that. Yeah, right. Right. I was not reading clearly. So denotes that a paradigm constructs how reality is perceived, defined. Peggy and Tom, could you offer some books or articles that may focus on how linguistics shapes cognition and perception within the OD work stream? Perhaps NEXUS4Change could email them out so you have time to think about them. You may have some off the top. I have one book that I'll share. Where's Hector? Where's the book that I gave you? The book that I gave you. So there's one book I will share that I gave someone here today. But Peggy or Tom, do you want to offer some of your thoughts?
I have two books that come to mind. Great. One I actually pulled out, the Dialogic Organization Development book by Bob Marshak and Jervis Bush. They base their theory for dialogue on three notions, which I'm attempting to pull up here. Complexity and emergence, three elements to the theory base. I put the other two together in what I call generative discourse, but the role of narrative and discourse, and Bob Marshak writes about narrative and discourse as it relates to OD in this book, and then the idea of generative images is the third leg. So I definitely recommend what they say, and the other is a book that I read many years ago called The Spell of the Sensuous, which is actually about the introduction of language and how that language itself became a paradigm shift in how humans relate to the world. And I believe the author is David Abrams.
So for me, I mostly I've gotten most of my stuff from blogs and just things on the internet. I guess the one that comes to mind is what's called Worf's hypothesis, WHORF, and that's the notion that we use language to create our reality, and that is, you know. And you think about this, and it really does create reality. If you walk into work one day and you find 5 people saying, you know, oh, Tom, you don't look so well today. You don't look so well today. By noon, I'm not feeling so well. And so just the words have an impact because that creates reality. But then you turn that into OD and you say, if you can do things like Bob Marshak and Jervis Bush talk about in their book about combining things and getting people to use a new term of language, you have the ability to combine interests that hadn't been there before. So like corporations and environmental movements, talking about the whole green movement. So the key is, you know, to keep thinking about these things in terms of how do we change the way that people talk, because that also changes the way that we think and act.
Great, thank you. And what I'll offer is one book that I gave out here that's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. They do a super job of bringing in the evidence that's directly related to how people learn, which gets at the way the brain operates, how people use language, and the role that it plays, and particularly where we operate, where we're thinking from, and how we use our language based on our executive function, and they call them System 1, System 2, and there's a variety of perspectives in here I really like. Another one that I would offer is it's a book called Conquest of Mind. It's by Eknath Easwaran, and he writes a book about meditation. And he basically describes how our brain, we're in charge of our brains, they're not in charge of us, and that we direct our thinking based on how we meditate. And he taught the first course on meditation in the United States in college, in a university setting in California. And so he really gets at this notion of the way we train our brain to think, which is we think in language and we think in words. And then the other one that we all are so aware of, the neuroscience of things and what's going on with neural pathways, and you can look at how our thinking and our language shifts our neural networks and has an impact on that. So that's another one that I would offer as well. So what I'd like to do is wrap up. Sorry, Peggy.
Can you both reminded me of a classic article that I think is a must read, and it's something I reread every few years, and it's David Cooperrider's Positive Image, Positive Action, which is I think the basis for his dissertation work and the foundation to appreciative inquiry, and drawing the correlation between the images that we hold and the impact it has on what we do. It's just packed with useful information.
That's awesome. Thank you, Peggy. So the last thing we're going to do is an appreciative checkout. I think that I'd like to know from the audience and from Chatland, what do you appreciate that you're going to take forth? So what do you appreciate that you're going to take forward? And it doesn't have to be everybody's going to necessarily share that, but I would like to get a little flavor from the room of what do you appreciate from the session with Peggy and Tom that you're going to take forth. Also from everybody out there in Chatland, if you can do it in the GoToWebinar control panel or in the chat seat, if you can share with us, what do you appreciate that you're going to take forth? And let me just give them 30 seconds, and then we'll do a brief checkout and share that with you two as we close up for the day. I'm really, really grateful for what you shared. And so we'll just have a moment of silence to reflect on that, and then we'll come back to you in 30 seconds. Okay, so we have people, and
Hi. I appreciate thinking about everybody here. Though I don't know everyone, I have a sense that we each, there's something in the models and the container and what each of you spoke about where each of us resonated more strongly. I did, there's a place. And so that helped me to, and I think potentially everyone, say, oh, that's where what I love fits and how what I love contributes to this whole bigger picture of this being a change agent rather than holding the whole, like, that's my spot. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate the idea of creating or asking the question that is large enough for us to invite the other side, and also the idea of the chaotic dance, the chaotic path that is not just as concrete and clear as we would like it to make it, and not as loose, so we don't get any results. So this dance between the two sides. Thank you.
Who am I talking?
Just hear you.
Okay. Excuse me. I appreciate, I had a revelation as I was listening to you both speak. I'm a professor with Steve at BG, and I got my doctorate at Case Western in organizational behavior. And I was hired at BG with everybody has made the assumption that I knew a lot about OD. But I'm an OB professor, not an OD professor. And so, and everybody's been asking me, well, why are you here today, Jane? And I'm realizing that I'm here today because I want to learn OD as well as OB. And when Peggy, when you mentioned David Cooper writer, I'm like, okay, yeah, I know the field, but I just need to continue to learn all of the things related to the processes, as you were talking about, Tom, the before, the middle, and the after, these kinds of things. It's all stuff that I teach about, so I know it, but I don't know it really deeply, and this is why I'm here. Thank you.
Hi, I want to say I appreciate hearing you talk about what makes a difference that matters, and also just as you talked, hearing the passion in your voices for the topic and the work that you do. Thank you.
Hi, I just want to appreciate how there's such a huge range of different kinds of people, how you have teachers, engineers, or like me, a 16-year-old who can still learn so much from this. Even if it's just a little bit, you can still bring this to another country like Canada or Toronto or my school, and it can touch a lot of people. It doesn't matter how old, how young, how different you are. This is just something that you can learn from.
Yeah, thank you. I got goosebumps. Can you see them? So online, Gita says, I like Peggy's line, creating the path as we walk on it. Reminds me that my role is to listen and empathize and trust that we'll be able to go with the flow together with the group. And Christopher says, thank you for the insights. I look forward to rolling around the ideas discussed more over the next few weeks. And so I'm not sure, Teo, did you want me to share that? So we'll come up here, Teo, and then we'll just say goodbye. So Teo's in the room in chat land typing and engaging. So
I suppose I had two things I really appreciated. One was when I first started about you guys' keynote, I felt like, well, some of that stuff seems counterintuitive. Like Tom is talking about structure and activities that you need at the beginning and the end. And Peggy's talking about a concept that has an element of chaos and being in the moment. And I think I'm getting much more comfortable with the idea that you need both. It's not an either or. It's how do you have enough structure to allow for chaos. And I don't. That's maybe even too simple. But Peggy, I was really struck by you pointing out the I versus them, moving from that to I and we. I find myself theming a lot of people. I find myself in conversations that have intent to be collaborative to, well, I'm sort of struggling with that perspective, so that becomes them and I, and I feel challenged to be more aware of that, to change it to that we. So thank you for that.
Cool. Thank you, Peggy, as well. And so everybody, come on up here. Anybody who can walk, because we gotta go. We got somebody with a broken foot. But just come on up here. Let's say goodbye. Come on up so they can see you. Come on up here so they can see you. So yeah, come on. We want to give Peggy and Tom a big group hug. Come on, give them a big group. And so I'm going to turn it over to you. Yes, and Peggy and Tom, if you could just share how are you as you're leaving? And hold on 1 second.
I appreciate being appreciated. and I truly appreciate your questions and passion and curiosity. So thank you for the interactions. I mean, that's what brings it alive for me, is knowing it makes a difference for you.
And for me, I definitely appreciate being invited to speak today. This was fun. I really appreciate the questions, because in settings like this, the questions always make me think about what I've learned in a different way. And so I learned some things today, so that was pretty cool. I guess the last thing I really appreciate is the fact that there is such an energized group of people who are interested in organizational development, who are grabbing at these roots, so you can go out and practice these. So so best wishes in that, and thank you for your participation and contribution to society.
High five. Bye, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
I love you all.
Bye.
Bye.